Most people think that the edge in macro trading is having the correct view. The research says it isn't, at least not primarily. Stanley Druckenmiller, one of the most successful macro traders of all time, known for his philosophy on cutting losses quickly and concentrating positions heavily on high conviction bets, puts it well with this well-known quote. It's not whether you're right or wrong that's important. What matters is how much you make when you're right and how much you lose when you're wrong. This idea that the view is cheap but the expression is what really matters is persistent throughout the macro trading landscape, and I believe it's the single most important key to success. My big picture vision with Temerity Holdings can be summarized as an AI-powered hedge fund. This video summarizes my first foray into the macro realm for the fund. I started with some research looking at primary sources about how players in the macro space actually operate. This video will start there. Then I'm going to briefly walk through a prototype that I built based on that research, and I'll conclude by summarizing what the prototype produced and what the next steps are. So before I built anything, I wanted to understand the landscape of macro practitioners. And by macro practitioners, I mean research services and capital allocators. I wanted to understand how they operate from first principles without any pre-imposed model. I researched primary sources spanning a broad spectrum from independent newsletter writers, institutional research firms, to live discretionary traders, pod shops, systematic CTAs, and even long horizon value investors. This section is a summary of my findings and how it informed my design decisions for my prototype. So zooming way out, I did research on two types of, we'll call them players, expressing macro opinions. Those whose product is a view and those whose product is a trade. Now, where do these players generate their revenue? Those whose product is a view generate their revenue or their edge from selling the view. Those whose product is a trade generate their revenue or their edge from either the model itself and or the risk and sizing machinery surrounding it. And I'll fill in the so-called archetypes of players that fit into each of these categories. So here are the archetypes that I came up with. These are not strict boundaries. Some of them have gray areas in between, and many players probably operate in those gray areas between two or several of these archetypes. But this is useful for thinking about the space from a big picture perspective. On the view selling side, we have narrative, regime allocation, and house view research. On the risk and sizing machinery side, we have discretionary funds and so-called pod shops. And on the model itself side, we have systematic and so-called CTA, as well as long horizon valuation reversion. And I've included some examples of these in the slides, as well as in the list of sources in the description. So now that we've created some broad definitions of the players in the space, how can we organize our thoughts on how they compare and contrast? There's a million ways to do this, many more complex and probably more accurate than what I'm about to show, but this is a simple, approachable starting point. Created a sliding scale for each of 6 dimensions. The first one we already talked about. What is the product? Is it a published view, or is it capital at risk, or is it some hybrid? The second one is where the edge is located. Is the edge coming from the actual view, from the underlying model, or is it coming from the risk machinery that wraps around the model? The third is the spectrum between systematic and discretionary. The fourth is regime formalization. Many of these players, in particular the regime allocation view sellers, share a formalized 2x2 grid that looks something like the following. This grid is a growth versus inflation regime cross, and it categorizes each of those two variables into one of two situations. Is inflation rising or falling, and is growth accelerating or decelerating? Then it uses those categorizations to frame the entire view. This was a major finding from our research. Growth and inflation are more often than not the master variables for how many of these players approach macro. Whether this is the formula 2x2, a structured regime, or a narrative backdrop, more often than not, everything comes back to growth and inflation. Next, we have input substrate. This is a tricky one to assign to a spectrum because there are nearly infinite sources of data out there. But the pattern that emerged in the research was many of the players gravitate toward either macro fundamental data or flows and liquidity data informing their inputs. And the final dimension is the time horizon for your view or your trade. So on one end, we have long-term secular, multi-year or decade-plus views. And then on the other end, we have tactical, cyclical, short-term swing trading type views. So now I'm just going to quickly show each of the 7 archetypes and roughly where they landed on this scale. And here's all 7 archetypes' central point overlaid on the 6-dimension axes. The biggest finding, like I said in the beginning of the video, is that the view is cheaper than its expression. The further right you move on the what is the product axis toward real capital at risk, the more edge migrates out of the view and into risk management, sizing, and portfolio construction. Pod shops are at the extreme end of the spectrum. An individual pod PM's job is to generate returns. But then the job of the platform is to aggregate and control the overall risk. Their exact methods for this are proprietary, but we know that they lead to high PM turnover due to stopouts, which is by design. So the view we can classify as being expressed within the pod is then aggregated as an input to the platform, and the risk wrapper at the platform level becomes the product. Another important point that the research surfaced that I'll mention here is that rate of change and divergence from expectations always beats levels. It's the delta, not the level, that matters. Also, an important nuance about the research service players is that their product being a view doesn't mean that risk management doesn't happen. Just means that they've explicitly deferred the risk management to their customers. So the institutions and investors who subscribe to the first three archetypes, narrative, regime, allocation, and house view, have their own risk, whether it's invested capital or business strategy exposure or some combination of the two. They apply their own risk management using the research as one input among others. The research service produces the view, the consumer decides what to do with it. When we say the view is the product, we mean the view is the entire deliverable. What the consumer does next is out of scope for the provider. Now, the provider has an incentive, obviously, to provide accurate, well-founded views. Otherwise, their customers will go elsewhere. But when I'm approaching how I want to structure my approach, given the nature of my project, I know I want to align more closely with those who have capital at risk rather than those who are simply selling a view. So with this knowledge in hand, how do I approach my prototype? There are things that AI can do efficiently, far more efficiently than humans, and to satisfactory accuracy given proper guardrails. What will those guardrails look like? I'm approaching that question by trying to strategically align my targets on the organizing axes with the strengths of AI and balancing human oversight and steering. At this stage, my primary use for AI in this project is to systemize my approach and expand my research and data ingestion capability. Here's my approach to where I wanted to land on these dimensions that I identified. The open circles represent rough targets for the prototype, and the arrows represent where I see it going in the future. I'm starting from a model portfolio approach, but there is still a narrative element to this, especially in the early stages when I want to see what's going on under the hood. The edge location right now sits pretty much in the middle because this is a single strategy, but I am concerned with systematic risk management and portfolio optimization, and I view that as migrating further toward the risk wrapper as I implement future iterations, potentially in parallel. Right now, there is a discretionary element, and I would like to migrate it to become more systematic. Right now, we're following a pretty closely formalized regime, which is the conventional wisdom standard practice. But I think an advantage of AI is that it can reason in higher dimensions than humans are capable of. So I would like to expand on that in the future. The input substrate we're going with for the prototype is very limited traditional macro fundamental data right now. But what's cool about this project is that it can be a sandbox for all sorts of data types that I would like to explore in the future. Right now, this is starting very much on the tactical, cyclical, shorter term time horizon side. I don't really envision changing that in the near future, but you never know. So with my approach in mind, now moving on to the prototype. This is a little schematic of what the prototype looks like. I started with a universe of liquid tradable US listed stocks and ETFs and some basic macro data. And for simplicity for the prototype run, I constrained the possible portfolio to a list of about a dozen ETFs. This framework has two modules. We have a view module, which consists of a macro state with four drivers: growth, inflation, policy rates, and liquidity. Given those drivers, the module constructs a scenario set of mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive scenarios and assigns probabilities and impacts to each. Then we have the construction module, which takes the scenario set and systematically constructs a portfolio of positions based on the probabilities and expected impacts. I like this framework because it's simple, easy to understand, and the modules can be upgraded separately. So here's a summary of the inputs from the scenario view module. The inputs here are twofold. One is a set of probabilities for the following 4 mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive scenarios. 2 is a matrix of impacts of each of these scenarios on the asset universe. What's important here is feeding these inputs into the system and getting back a valid size portfolio output that follows all of our rules. I did not fine-tune these probabilities. I did not fine-tune the impacts. They were simply hand estimated in order to test the pipeline. The important thing here is that they pass the smell test. They serve as valid inputs. The logical next step is to fine-tune these inputs, which I will talk about at the end of the video. So these are the results. The portfolio recommended by the first round. The construction logic is relatively simple. We score every instrument, in this case the small universe of ETFs, by an expected payoff, which is the sum of the scenario probabilities times the expected impact for each scenario. Then we rank by risk reward, which is expected payoff versus expected downside. We drop anything where that ratio is less than 1. After that, we set an initial size for each remaining instrument proportional to the risk reward ratio, and we scale exposure by a portfolio-wide volatility target. We then apply position caps and a minimum level of cash, and that leaves us with our final set of positions. So interesting results here. The portfolio is very light on equities, very heavy on gold and treasuries, some commodity exposure, and very heavy on cash. The raw position for gold actually exceeded the position cap, so we were capped at our maximum of 20% of the portfolio allocated to gold. Like I said, I did not fine-tune the inputs. Is this portfolio optimal? Maybe, probably not. But the inputs at least passed the smell test, and the result was a portfolio that I guess you could say passes the smell test. It conforms to all of our rules, which in my book is a win for the prototype. So I'll conclude with a quick review of what the prototype produced and what's next. So what went well? I did the research, used it to create a simple pipeline that successfully ran end to end, demonstrating that the process works. The positions conform to the rules. Are they optimal? Maybe. Are they logically sound? Yes. That's what we were going for. So like I said, the portfolio result that we got is probably suboptimal because I used a single scenario set that was hand-built. The scenario set contained 4 scenarios for growth, inflation, policy rates, and liquidity, which are key macro drivers, but there's no rigorous derivation or clearly defined outcomes and timeframes. At this stage, there's not much difference from this and narrative research. Like I said in the beginning of the video, the view is cheap. So what comes next? The first and most important upgrade this prototype needs is systematic input derivation. We need to rigorously derive scenario probabilities and impacts. We also need to account for more than one set of factors. Right now, we don't even come close to having a comprehensive view of underlying factors driving macro conditions. We have a very limited view based on one set of scenarios, largely revolving around policy rates. Policy rates are an important, arguably the most important driver, but they are by no means the only driver. Additionally, I want to improve portfolio construction and automate the data pipeline. Stay tuned for these upgrades and more. Comment anything you think I missed or that I should do next. Like and subscribe, and thank you for watching.